biting wind swept through the dusty main street of Cheyenne as Ruby Hatheraway stepped down from the stagecoach. Her boots sank into the hard-packed dirt, and she clutched her small valise to her chest. She felt every stare on her body, from the ranch hands gawking at her curves to the older women sneering at the worn edges of her bonnet. No one was subtle. No one was kind. And there was no warm welcome for a mail-order bride that no one seemed to want. But beneath her fear, beneath her humiliation, one thing in Ruby refused to die. A small flame of determination kept burning. Ruby had traveled 5 long days from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The coach had jolted her bones, rattled her nerves, and tested her hope. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement from a rancher named Harold Beckett, a man who promised a home, companionship, and stability. For a woman who had lost her parents in a fire and lived with relentless judgment about her full figure, Harold's offer felt like a chance at a real future. But Cheyenne was nothing like she imagined. It was loud and rough, filled with dust clouds, the smell of horses, and people too busy to care. Ruby lifted her chin and searched the street for Harold Beckett. He wasn't there. Minutes stretched into hours. She waited under the station's small awning until the sun began to set behind the rooftops. Finally, the station master, Seth, a wiry man with kind eyes, approached her. "Miss, are you expectin' someone?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Mr. Harold Beckett. He was supposed to meet me here." Seth scratched his chin. "Don't know him myself, but I'll ask around." Might be he got delayed. Ruby nodded, but a cold fear tightened her chest. What if Harold saw her wide hips and soft shoulders, and changed his mind? As lantern light spilled across the street, Ruby accepted she could not wait there forever. She asked Seth for a place to stay, and he directed her to Wilmer's boarding house. With trembling legs and a tightening throat, Ruby walked through the dusty road alone. Inside the boarding house, Wilmer, a large woman with a no-nonsense stare, showed her to a small room. "Men get cold feet sometimes," Wilmer said gently. "You're not the first to be left waitin'." Ruby tried to smile, but the words cut deep. In the privacy of her room, her heart cracked. She sat on the edge of the bed and cried quietly. Not just for the humiliation, but for the fear that she had crossed the entire country only to be abandoned like she wasn't worth a second glance. Morning came too quickly. Ruby forced herself downstairs for breakfast. She had to find Harold. She could not let her life end in one humiliating moment. After eating, she searched the town, mercantile, smithy, saloon, but no one knew Harold Beckett. Finally, a clerk at the feed store snapped his fingers. "Oh, him. He was lookin' to sell his ranch," he said. "Ain't seen him for months." Sell his ranch? Ruby's heart dropped. If he sold it, there was no home waiting for her. No future. No husband. The clerk shrugged like it was nothing, and 2 ranch hands nearby snickered under their breath. "Poor woman," one whispered. Betty took one look at her and ran. Heat flamed across Ruby's cheeks. She turned away and left the store as their laughter followed her. What she didn't see was the tall man on the boardwalk outside who heard everything. Sawyer Mallister, a rugged mountain trapper, stood with a sack of flour slung over one shoulder. His dark hair fell across his brow, his clothes worn from years of wilderness living. He rarely spoke to townsfolk. He rarely came down from the snow-covered mountains where he lived alone. But when he glanced inside the feed store and saw Ruby's tear-streaked face as she ran out, something inside him tightened. He understood being mocked. He understood being an outsider. And something about the hurt in her eyes struck him harder than any cold mountain wind. He watched her disappear down the street. "You know her story?" Sawyer asked Dr. Weston, who had walked up beside him. "Mail-order bride was left behind," the doctor said sadly. "She's stayin' at Wilmer's, poor thing." Sawyer nodded once. A quiet, settled decision flickered in his eyes. Minutes later, he was climbing the steps of Wilmer's boarding house. He set his supplies down, removed his hat, and stepped inside. Wilmer raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Mallister," she greeted. "Didn't expect you. Need a room?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Looking for the lady who came in yesterday." Wilmer studied his face. "Why?" Sawyer rubbed the back of his neck. "Just think she might need some help." Wilmer softened. "She's in the parlor." Sawyer nodded his thanks and walked to the doorway. Ruby sat on a small floral sofa, her face buried in her hands as she tried to hold back shaking breaths. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am?" Ruby startled, wiping her tears, trying to compose herself. "Yes, can I help you?" Sawyer held his hat respectfully. "Name's Sawyer Mallister. I heard about your situation. Thought maybe I could help." Ruby blinked, confused. "Help? Why? You don't even know me." Sawyer took a quiet breath. "I know what it's like to be alone out here. I know what it's like to be judged for what folks think they see." Her eyes softened, but doubt lingered. Sawyer continued, choosing each word with care. "I ain't looking for a wife. Not making any promises like that, but I got a cabin in the mountains. Safe, quiet. You could stay until you get your bearings." Ruby stared at him. A stranger. A man with rough hands and tired eyes. A man who wasn't mocking her. "Why would you do this for me?" she whispered. Sawyer lowered his gaze. "Because you deserve better than being left on the street by a man who didn't see your worth." The room felt still. Ruby's chest ached, not with fear this time, but with something warm and unexpected. Maybe hope. "May I have time to think?" she asked. Sawyer nodded. "I'll be at the livery in the morning, if you decide you want a safe place to start over." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ruby breathless. And though she didn't know it yet, that moment was the first step toward the wildest, most life-changing journey of her life. Ruby barely slept that night. The boarding house walls creaked with every gust of wind, and her thoughts raced faster than any stagecoach across the plains. Sawyer's offer echoed in her mind. A cabin in the mountains. Safety. A chance to breathe. A place where no one laughed at her curves or judged her worth by the size of her waist. But he was a stranger. A mountain man. A man who lived in a world far from everything she knew. Still, staying in Cheyenne with no money, no family, and no one willing to hire a woman alone felt far more dangerous. When morning came, Ruby folded the last of her belongings into her small valise. She paused at the room's door, taking one final look at the four plain walls. This room had held her shame, her fear, and her heartbreak. She would not let it hold her future. She walked down to the livery stable, heart pounding. Sawyer Mallister stood there already, loading supplies onto a mule. His strong frame moved with quiet strength, each motion steady and sure. When he saw her approaching, he gave a simple nod. "You decided." Ruby swallowed hard. "Yes. If your offer still stands." "It does," he said without hesitation. "You'll be safe." His calm certainty steadied something inside her. He helped her onto a gentle mare and secured her valise behind the saddle. The ride began slow, steady, heading away from Cheyenne's dusty streets and into open plains. The land stretched wide beneath an endless blue sky. The air smelled of sagebrush and sun-warmed earth. Ruby's nerves settled little by little. Sawyer didn't speak much. When he did, his words were simple and honest. "You ridin' all right?" "Yes," she answered, though her legs trembled. "I'm doing my best." That's all anyone can ask. They camped under the stars that night, beside a clear running creek. The fire crackled between them as Ruby stirred a pot of beans. She watched Sawyer from across the flames. The shadows cast by the firelight softened the sharpness of his features. He was rugged, yes, but something gentle lived in his eyes. She gathered her courage. "Why do you live so far from people?" Sawyer poked the fire with a stick. Sparks drifted upward like tiny stars. "People judge too quickly," he said. "Say things without thinking. Up in the mountains, the only things you face are weather, work, and yourself." Ruby understood more than she let on. The next day, the land began to rise. Pine trees thickened around them. The air grew cooler and cleaner. They crossed small streams and followed narrow paths woven between rocks and wildflowers. And then, As the sun tilted low behind the trees, Sawyer finally pointed ahead. There. Nestled in a sheltered valley stood a small log cabin with a stone chimney, a corral, and a few storage sheds. It wasn't grand, it wasn't fancy, but it felt steady, it felt safe, it felt like a place built by hands that knew hard work and quiet nights. "It's beautiful," Ruby whispered. Sawyer glanced at her with a faint smile. "Glad you think so." Inside, the cabin held a warm scent of pine and wood smoke, with worn but clean quilts and sturdy furniture. Sawyer showed her the small spare room. "It's yours," he said. "I'll take the loft." Ruby felt something swell softly in her chest. Kindness, respect, two things she had gone years without. Over the next weeks, Ruby settled into life in the mountains. She helped Sawyer chop firewood, haul water, tend the animals, and prepare meals. Her strength, mocked in town, became a blessing here. Sawyer noticed. He said little, but when he did, his praise hit deep. "You're stronger than most folks I've seen." Ruby glowed for hours after that. Sawyer also taught her to use a rifle. "You need to protect yourself out here," he explained. She aimed with shaky arms, missed the tree stump entirely, and jumped at the recoil. He corrected her stance, his hands steadying her shoulders. For a brief moment, she felt his breath warm near her ear, and her heart thumped harder than any shot she fired. Nights were spent by the fire. Ruby sewing or reading, Sawyer carving small wooden figures or mending traps. In the quiet between them, something gentle and unspoken grew. A bond forged not by promises, but by presence. Still, Ruby never let herself believe Sawyer saw her as anything more than a guest, a woman he had rescued, a woman he pitied. That fear stayed hidden deep in her heart. One cold night, a snowstorm trapped them inside the cabin for days. Ruby listened to the wind roar outside as Sawyer worked to keep the fire strong. In the flickering light, she noticed how tired he looked, how he stole quiet glances at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Something in those glances made her breath catch, but she told herself not to hope. Hope had hurt her too many times. When spring finally arrived, Sawyer announced they needed to go into Cheyenne to trade furs for supplies. Ruby's stomach twisted. That town held her worst memories, but she nodded. "I'll go with you." Cheyenne looked the same as before, but Ruby felt different, stronger. She walked beside Sawyer with her head high. While Sawyer traded pelts, Ruby visited the post office. Out of habit, she asked if any letters had arrived. To her shock, the postmaster handed her a worn envelope. The name on the corner turned her blood cold. Harold Beckett. Her missing fiancé. Her breath trembled as she opened it. The words blurred as she read. "I am sorry. I left in haste. I failed you. I want you to join me in Denver. I still wish for you to be my wife." Ruby's knees weakened. Sawyer found her on the boardwalk, the letter limp in her hand. She offered it to him, her voice barely a whisper. "He wants me back." Sawyer read it with steady eyes, but Ruby saw the hurt flicker beneath his calm. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I don't know." Sawyer nodded, jaw tight. "A man should keep his word," he said softly. "Maybe Denver is better than a cabin with me." Something inside Ruby cracked at those words. Before she could answer, he turned away, and she felt a cold wind sweep through her chest. That night at their campsite outside town, silence hung heavy between them. Ruby stared at the fire, her heart torn in two. Finally, Sawyer spoke. "I brought you to the mountains to keep you safe, not to trap you." She looked up, tears burning her eyes. "You didn't trap me. You saved me." "Maybe," he said, "but you deserve a life full of people. A real community, not just me and the trees." Ruby's voice trembled. "Sawyer, why did you help me?" He stared into the fire, his jaw working. "Because I saw someone who deserved better than what she got." Something inside her broke open. "Sawyer, I don't want Denver," she whispered. "I don't want a man who abandoned me." He stayed quiet, still staring at the fire. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Ruby took a shaky breath. "I want the man who saw worth in me when no one else did. The man who gave me a home. The man who made me feel safe." Sawyer froze. His hand tightened around his mug. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But Ruby saw it. Hope, real hope, burning behind his eyes. What neither of them knew was that the hardest test was still ahead. The fire crackled softly between them, sending orange light dancing across Sawyer's tired face. Ruby waited for him to speak, but he stared into the flames with an expression she couldn't read, a mix of longing, fear, and something deeper he didn't dare name. Before either of them could say more, a cold wind swept through their small camp. Sawyer shivered once, a sharp, strange movement Ruby had never seen from him. When she reached out to touch his arm, she felt the heat burning under his skin. "Sawyer, are you all right?" Quote. He tried to steady himself, but his voice came out in a rough whisper, "Just tired." Ruby didn't believe him, and by morning her fear came true. Sawyer couldn't stand. He collapsed against the bedroll, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Panic surged through Ruby as she knelt beside him. His skin was burning hot, his eyes glassy with confusion. "No," she whispered. "Not now. Not when Not when she finally understood her heart. She hauled him onto the horse with strength she didn't know she had, and rode hard through the rough terrain to find Dr. Weston. When the doctor saw Sawyer slumped over the saddle, he didn't waste a second. "Fever's taken, him fast," he warned. "We must get him to the cabin." The ride back felt endless. Ruby stayed by Sawyer's side every moment, sponging his forehead, whispering to him when he drifted in and out of delirium. Days passed in a blur of fear. She held his hand through every breath he fought for. More than once, she feared he wouldn't make it. Then one morning, his eyes finally opened. Clear, aware, focused on her. "You stayed," he croaked. Ruby's breath broke with relief. "Of course I stayed. Where else would I go?" Quote. He lifted a trembling hand to her cheek, and Ruby covered it with both of hers, pressing it close. That small touch told her everything she had been afraid to hope for. Sawyer Mallister needed her, and she needed him. As the weeks passed, he regained his strength, and Ruby carried the cabin's workload alone. She chopped wood, cooked meals, tended animals, and kept Sawyer warm through the cold mountain nights. She proved her hard-earned strength in every step she took. When Sawyer grew strong enough to walk outside again, he stopped Ruby under the pines. The valley lay wide below them, covered in wildflowers swaying in the wind. He took her hands in his. "I never planned on taking a wife," he said quietly. "Didn't think I deserved one. Didn't think any woman would want a life like mine." Ruby's heart pounded. "But livin' with you these months." He swallowed, emotion thick in his voice. "Ruby, I don't want a life without you." Her eyes filled with tears. "Sawyer, I ain't got a ring," he said. "I ain't got fancy words. But if you'd take me, if you'd be my wife, I'd spend my life providing for you and protecting you. I'd cherish you, that I promise." Ruby let out a trembling breath. "That's all I ever wanted. Yes, Sawyer. Yes." They shared quiet vows right there among the whispering pine trees, the mountains standing tall like witnesses of old. Their lips met in a soft, aching kiss that warmed Ruby's entire being. It wasn't rushed or wild. It was a promise. A bond sealed by love that had grown slowly and surely, like the mountains themselves. Weeks later, Dr. Weston made their marriage official with his small Bible. Ruby and Sawyer stood beneath the same pine canopy, hand in hand, smiling at a love neither had expected but both fiercely cherished. Life in the mountains didn't magically become easy. They worked hard every day. Winters were brutal, food was never wasted, and dangers still lived in the wild. But Ruby and Sawyer faced every challenge side by side. Her body, once mocked, became a symbol of strength and resilience. Sawyer loved every part of her, not in spite of her figure, but because it was her. And Ruby, once trembling under society's judgment, now stood tall as a mountain wife. Fierce, capable, loved. A year after their marriage, they traveled back to Cheyenne to file the final paperwork. Ruby rode with confidence, wearing a simple dress she had sewn herself, her chin high, her smile warm. Sawyer walked beside her proudly. People stared again, but this time for different reasons. She was radiant, strong, happy, a woman transformed. Then Ruby saw him, Harold Beckett. He stood near the stagecoach, shocked at the sight of her. He stepped forward, hat in hand. "Ruby, I hardly recognized you." She nodded politely. "I received your letter. I hope you're well." Harold swallowed hard. "I came here, hoping you'd change your mind." Sawyer stepped forward, tall and calm. She didn't. Harold looked between them, regret clouding his eyes. "I'm sorry for what I did to you." Ruby gave a small, warm smile, not for him, but for herself. "I know," she said, "and I forgive you, but I found my home, my life, my husband." Harold nodded slowly. "Then I wish you happiness." Ruby watched him walk away and felt nothing but peace, because the woman she had become no longer needed his approval. She had found a love built on truth, kindness, and strength. As Ruby and Sawyer rode back to the mountains, her head rested against his shoulder. "You sure you don't miss the city life?" he teased. Ruby laughed softly. "Not a bit. My place is with you, always." Sawyer kissed the top of her head, his hand resting over hers as the trail opened before them. Together, they headed home. Into the mountains. Into the life they built. Into a love that never needed permission from the world to be real. Their story proved one thing. The world may mock what it does not understand, but true love sees deeper, and the mountains never lie.